So the second wave of this pandemic has taken a devastating toll on the country's economy. Job numbers for the month of January were 5 times worse than expected. Lockdowns and restrictions led to 213,000 job losses last month. That pushed the jobless rate up 0.6 percentage points to 9.4%, the highest level since August. Almost all of the losses were in Ontario and Quebec. That drop was offset by job gains in a few provinces. Let's bring in the primetime panel now. The Globe and Mail's Laura Stone, campaign strategist and partner at Northweather, Zane Velji, and with us for this discussion, Mikhail Skuterud, an economics professor at the University of Waterloo. Welcome back to the show, folks, and welcome, Professor.
Thanks for
Hi, David.
having me.
Hey, David.
Professor, I'd like to start with you. The drop in jobs, much larger than many economists were predicting. How does it compare to what's been happening to this point throughout the pandemic?
I think it compares best to what we saw in March and April, and that's when there were similar, pretty strict lockdowns or shutdowns that were happening at the very beginning of this pandemic. And what we saw today in the data it's not nearly as dramatic as those declines, but there's similarities. We're sort of moving back. The progress we've made is slipping.
You know, if you look at the sectors hit, the people hit, it's kind of the parts of the economy and the people in the economy could really least afford this. I mean, just walk us through this, where the job losses are and who's being most affected.
So it's exactly what I guess everybody would guess it is. We all know at this point, when we need to impose these public health measures, who gets shut down? It's retail, it's restaurants, it's hotels, it's tourism, it's kind of entertainment, movie theaters, and these industry sectors employ a lot of low-wage workers, a lot of young workers, disproportionately women. These are the groups that can least afford to take this hit at this point.
You know, Zane, today Erin O'Toole was saying that the key to the economic recovery is getting people vaccinated, and then these job numbers are there, right? I mean, so what kind of pressure do these job numbers put on governments at every level to start to get things under control?
You're absolutely right, David. You know, this concept of jobs and economy can't be considered in isolation. It is singular with COVID and its response. And unfortunately for the Trudeau government, that COVID response now lies in the vaccination stage, where we're starting to use terms like bungled and, you know, perhaps disastrous or delayed to be the most charitable of those descriptions. So the fact is that these job numbers, especially who the job losses are to, racialized Canadians, low-wage workers, women, these are all individuals that Justin Trudeau would certainly like to have in his coalition next time he runs for office, whether that's the spring, summer, or fall, so to speak. So it's going to not just add pressure, it's going to add pressure in a real interesting and significant way based on who's losing work, especially when you are a government that is suggesting you're standing up for these individuals in a real meaningful way, like no government has before. So it becomes a really hard sort of argument for Trudeau and his government when he's trying to suggest that these are the individuals he's trying to protect, when the job losses singularly fall into that category, and now the main connective tissue between economy and public health, the vaccination rollout, isn't going so well.
You know, Laura, I have tremendous sympathy and no envy for the political leaders who have to manage this tension, right? Between the economic stress and the desire to reopen just to keep your business afloat, to keep your family afloat, but then the need to sort of contain the spread of the virus. And it's pretty clear when things are closed, cases go down. I mean, how does this play into that decision-making? We're here in Ontario, there's signs maybe that the Ford government, for example, could be looking at a reopening in the not-so-distant future.
Well, we've seen this debate, this push and pull throughout this pandemic. You know, we have the public health experts, the epidemiologists shouting obviously about the public health concerns and saying in order to do that, we really need to shut things down. And then, of course, we've had the business community, particularly the small business community, which has been really disproportionately hit hard during this pandemic through no fault of their own, but the government's had to make very tough decisions to close them down. So I think what we've seen is kind of a growing impatience, possibly with provincially with the governments. You know, we saw Alberta starting to talk about loosening things up more, Quebec a little bit, and then in Ontario they'll have to make that decision next week. We don't expect the stay-at-home order to get lifted right away, but in the near future it likely would. And there's talk too about potentially changing some of the retail rules as well here in Ontario. So it's the debate, it dogs every provincial leader because this is people's livelihoods. This is entrepreneurs who worked all their lives to build a business and who can see it vanish within a year because of this health emergency. So I don't envy them either, David. It's really tough, and I think also the public is getting really sick and tired of the manic decision making and pace of this and the constant reopening and closing. So I think that I don't know that there's a public appetite anymore for another set of widespread closures if we do begin to open up slowly, at least.
Professor, I wonder if you could look at the long-term implications of this, because when you look at the sectors that have been hit, you understand it, right? It is because of the lockdowns, it's because things have been forced to be closed and stay home, so the demand for those services has gone away temporarily, right? It's not a structural collapse necessarily in the economy, but serious for those people, serious for those businesses. But what are the long-term implications for the labor market? I mean, can this roar back the minute we get to the point of high levels of vaccination and low levels of restrictions?
So when I was on your show the last time, back in like May, that's exactly what I was talking about, is that, a certain group of workers are going to be left behind in this recovery, which now is become more complicated than ever. And what economists talk about, borrow a term from physicists. We call it hysteresis. Hysteresis is the idea when you push on a rubber band, does the rubber band come right back to its original state, perfect original state? And economy is very much like that. You push on an economy, you hit it with a crisis or a shock like this. The fact is they don't come back to the way they were. We are definitely not going back to the economy that we had. We will be in a very different place. We're going on to a very different path. And predominantly there's going to be, structural changes in the economy. The types of jobs that people are doing is going to be different. It's been affected by this shock. And that matters for policy, but most importantly, it matters for those folks who've been out. There's a large chunk of the Canadian labor force that have been out of work for more than 10 months now. Getting those folks back engaged in the labor market, searching for work, finding perhaps jobs in new occupations that they're not familiar with, those are big challenges that lay ahead for us.
Yeah, and that's a good point to make, and Zane, for us to keep in mind that the top line numbers, the aggregate numbers, employment numbers could come back. But, the pub on your favorite street, your favorite coffee shop, the local diner, these things may never come back because of the impact of this sort of thing. And that becomes, to some degree, I think, a political problem in the fallout of this, or the bridge to that, to make sure as many of those small businesses in particular survive.
Oh, absolutely. And to Laura's point, small businesses were hit the hardest, right? And this is where you're looking at, how does the Trudeau government reconcile with a natural reality that this pandemic has been an accelerant to some of the changes we saw on the cusp? There's been no better time, one may argue, for knowledge sector workers. They've got more flexibility. We've seen those at the top of this, capitalist heap are making more money than ever. So there are workers, quote unquote, that are doing well. But how does the Trudeau government reconcile with these shifts that have now been accelerated because of this pandemic and face them for what it is, whether that be retooling, retraining, and ensuring that people have the jobs for the future, because the future has come a lot quicker for many, versus ensuring that these, low-wage jobs still come back because services still need to be provided. I'm now adding another voice to the echo of not having envy for our political decision makers, but this is one of those other tensions, David, that they're going to have to figure out going forward. The reality of what the future looks like, but also ensuring that the individuals that need to get back to work get back to work.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, folks. It was a great conversation. I want to thank you all, and thank you to Professor Mikhail Skuterud for joining us for this segment. Coming up, the primetime panel is going to be joined by David Coletto of Abacus Data, whose new polling shows support for the Liberals and Conservatives about as tight as it can get. Stay with us.